Hello, welcome to week 3 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this week. The topic for this week is the rise and spread of liberal democracy. There are 3 assignments to complete for this week, as usual. There's a discussion board forum, a quiz, and a primary source assignment. So, in looking at this unit, the first thing I'd like to address is, what is liberal democracy? Well, I think we all have a sense of what the term democracy means. Democracy is a system of government that is based upon the will of the people as expressed through free elections. So that's the democracy piece. A government that's based upon the will of the people, where the government is elected through the leaders of the government are chosen through free elections. The liberal piece can be a little bit confusing because the term liberal has changed in meaning over time. This phrase is based on the classical meaning of the word liberal, which comes from the word liberty. And in this context, liberal means that people's basic or natural rights are protected. So, in a liberal democracy, not all things are subject to a democratic vote. A democratic vote in a liberal democracy can't be taken to deny any person or group of their basic rights. So, in a pure democracy without any sort of liberal constitution, democracy could be quite terrible, potentially. What if the majority vote to imprison or murder an entire group of people who are in the minority? That's not what we think of when we think of a democracy, because we inherently think of a liberal democracy. So in a liberal democracy, our basic human rights aren't up for a vote. Right? So the Supreme Court, for example, declared that segregation violates our Constitution. That's a liberal, that's a ruling, that's a liberal democratic ruling. So even if a majority of people in Alabama would have voted in support of segregation, that's not permissible in a liberal democracy because it violates the rights of the minority. So another example would be marriage equality. Even if a majority of Americans in a particular state would vote against marriage equality, the Supreme Court has ruled that that's a protected right, essentially. So not everything is up for a democratic vote. So this week we're looking at the spread of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy emerges as a concept out of the Enlightenment, which began in the 17th century in Europe and then spread. There are far more liberal democracies in the world today than there were 50 years ago. So there has been a spread of liberal democracy over time. Nations in Eastern Europe are a good example of this. 50 years ago, all of the countries in Eastern Europe were governed by communist dictatorships. Today, many of the countries in Eastern Europe are liberal democracies. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of Soviet communism, a huge number of new liberal democratic states emerged. They transitioned from being communist dictatorships to liberal democracies. Now, for this week, for the discussion board, you're asked to read a text by a scholar from Stanford University named Francis Fukuyama. Interestingly, he was a student of Samuel Huntington, whose work we looked at last week. Francis Fukuyama argues that the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the fall of the Berlin Wall marks the end of history. Now, what does he mean by the end of history? I would argue that when he says the end of history, he's referring to the triumph of liberal democracy. Fukuyama is arguing that communism was the last significant challenger to liberal democracy as a political system, and that with the collapse of communism, there is no other ideology or belief system that can challenge liberal democracy. So if history is a struggle of ideas, Fukuyama says that struggle of ideas has ended because liberal democracy has emerged triumphant. And there's no serious threat to liberal democracy in the contemporary world. For the primary source assignment, you're going to be reading a document from the United Nations that sets out a view of natural rights or basic human rights, which of course is a foundation of liberal democracy, and you're asked to interpret that document, to analyze that document. So I hope it will be an interesting unit for you. I look forward to working with you.